May 5, 1945. The single jeep bounced violently over the cratered Austrian road as Lieutenant Albert Whitlock gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. Beside him sat Private First Class Harold Johnson, cradling an M1 Garand rifle across his lap, while Corporal Eugene Martinez and Private Robert Henderson occupied the rear seats, their eyes scanning the surrounding pine forests with practiced wariness. They were supposed to be conducting a routine reconnaissance patrol, but the crackling radio message that had just come through changed everything. Intelligence had located a massive German force. Estimates suggested somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 troops, retreating through the mountains near the town of Sankt Leonhard im Pitztal. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were remnants of the Wehrmacht and SS units fleeing the advancing Allied forces, desperate men who still possessed enough weapons and ammunition to cause catastrophic damage. The war in Europe was dying, but like a wounded predator, it could still kill with its last breath. Major General John Dahlquist had given Whitlock his orders with a gravity that made the young lieutenant's stomach tighten. Find the German column, assess their strength, report back. Simple enough, except nothing was simple when you were 4 men in a single vehicle facing an entire army. According to historical records preserved in the National Archives and documented by military historian Stephen Ambrose in his works on World War II operations, small reconnaissance units like Whitlock's were the eyes and ears of the larger Allied advance, often operating miles ahead of friendly lines with nothing but their wits and weapons for protection. The jeep crested a ridge, and what Whitlock saw made him slam on the brakes so hard that Martinez nearly flew out of the back. Stretched across the valley below was a sight that belonged in a fever dream. An endless river of field gray uniforms, horses, trucks, and artillery pieces snaking through the Alpine Pass. The column extended as far as the eye could see in both directions, a massive serpent of defeated but still dangerous military power. "Sweet Mother of God," Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. Whitlock's mind raced through his limited options. They could turn around, race back to headquarters, deliver their report, and let someone else deal with this nightmare. That was the sensible choice, the one that kept all 4 of them alive to see tomorrow. But as he studied the German column through his binoculars, he noticed something crucial, something that changed everything. The soldiers looked exhausted, their movements sluggish and defeated. Officers were arguing among themselves, pointing in different directions. There was no coordinated defensive posture, no scouts on the flanks, no rear guard securing their retreat. This wasn't an army preparing to fight. This was a mass of humanity simply trying to survive. An insane idea began forming in Whitlock's mind. Whitlock had always possessed what his academy instructors called creative tactical thinking, though his fellow officers often used less charitable terms like reckless or dangerously unorthodox. Born in September 1920 in rural Pennsylvania, he'd grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the First World War, tales of courage and sacrifice that had planted the seeds of military ambition in his young mind. He'd joined the Army in 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, driven by a fierce determination to prove himself. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. "Lieutenant, we should head back," Martinez said from the rear seat, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. The corporal was right, of course. Standard operating procedure demanded they maintain observation distance and avoid contact with superior enemy forces. Whitlock lowered his binoculars and turned to face his 3 companions. These men had followed him through the hell of the Normandy hedgerows, across the blood-soaked fields of France, and through the frozen misery of the Battle of the Bulge. They'd earned his respect 100 times over, and he owed them honesty. "That column contains at least 15,000 men," he said quietly. "Maybe more. If they decide to make a stand, or worse, scatter into these mountains as guerrilla units, they could tie up entire Allied divisions for months. More Americans will die. More civilians will get caught in the crossfire." Henderson, the youngest of the group at barely 20 years old, shifted nervously. "What are you thinking, sir?" The question hung in the cold mountain air as Whitlock gathered his thoughts. Military historians have long debated the psychological factors that led to Germany's collapse in the final weeks of the war, as documented in Rick Atkinson's comprehensive Liberation trilogy. The Wehrmacht of May. 1945 was a shadow of its former self, exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly aware that their cause was utterly lost. Many soldiers were desperately seeking ways to surrender to American or British forces, rather than face Soviet captivity. What if, Whitlock began slowly, we could convince them to surrender? Right here, right now, without firing a single shot. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. Johnson was the first to respond, his weathered face creasing into an expression somewhere between disbelief and dark amusement. Lieutenant, there are 4 of us, and at least 15,000 of them. Even if they wanted to surrender, why would they believe we could accept it? They'd think we were insane. Exactly, Whitlock replied, a grim smile forming. But what if we act so confident, so completely convinced, that we have overwhelming force at our disposal, that they believe the insanity? The plan that Whitlock outlined in the next 15 minutes was either brilliant or suicidal. His 3 companions couldn't quite decide which. They would drive directly into the German column, locate the commanding officer, and demand immediate surrender. The key was absolute confidence, treating the entire situation as if the outcome were already predetermined. They don't know how many troops we have behind us, Whitlock explained, his voice gaining strength as the plan crystallized. These mountains are perfect terrain for concealing forces. If we act like we're the advance guard of a massive army, if we're bold enough, they might just believe it. Martinez pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, lit one with trembling hands, and took a long drag. Lieutenant, I've followed you through some crazy situations, but this one takes the cake. You know that, right? Whitlock nodded grimly. I do. And I won't order any of you to come with me. This is volunteer only. You 3 can head back right now, report what we've seen, and no one will think less of you. The 3 soldiers exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. Finally, Johnson checked his rifle and said simply, Well, I didn't come all the way to Austria to miss the show. Henderson and Martinez nodded their agreement, though their faces remained pale with controlled terror. At precisely 1100 hours, according to the after-action report filed with the 36th Infantry Division headquarters, Whitlock put the Jeep in gear and began driving down the winding mountain road toward the German column. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. As they approached the first German units, soldiers turned to stare at the audacious American Jeep rolling boldly into their midst. Rifles were raised, orders shouted in rapid German, but Whitlock kept driving at a steady, unhurried pace, as if he owned every inch of the road. He'd removed his helmet, wanting the Germans to see his face clearly, to read the absolute confidence he was projecting. A German sergeant stepped into the road, waving his arms frantically for them to stop. Whitlock complied, bringing the Jeep to a smooth halt. The sergeant approached, his Mauser rifle pointed directly at Whitlock's chest, shouting questions in German. Whitlock didn't speak German beyond a handful of basic phrases, but he'd worked with enough German prisoners to understand the sergeant's demand for identification and orders. Instead of responding directly, he fixed the sergeant with a cold stare and said in clear, slow English, "Take me to your commanding officer, now." The absolute authority in his voice, combined with the sheer insanity of 4 Americans driving casually into 15,000 German troops, created a moment of cognitive dissonance. The sergeant hesitated, lowering his rifle slightly, uncertainty replacing aggression on his weathered face. The sergeant's hesitation stretched into seconds that felt like hours. Behind him, more German soldiers had gathered, forming a loose semicircle around the Jeep, their weapons held at uncertain angles. Whitlock could feel Johnson tensing beside him, knew that Martinez and Henderson were probably calculating their chances of surviving if shooting started. The answer was simple. They wouldn't. But Whitlock had gambled everything on a fundamental truth about military psychology. Soldiers, especially defeated soldiers, follow confident leadership. The German sergeant was looking at 4 Americans who should be terrified, but instead appeared almost bored, as if encountering 15,000 enemy troops was merely a minor inconvenience in their day. Finally, the sergeant made his decision. He barked orders to 2 nearby privates who scrambled to attention, then gestured for Whitlock to follow. The Jeep began moving again, now escorted by a dozen German soldiers, who jogged alongside, weapons still trained on the Americans but with decreasing hostility. They drove for nearly a kilometer through the massive column, and with every meter, Whitlock's assessment solidified. These men were finished. They wore defeat in every slumped shoulder, every hollow eye, every shuffling step. Many were bandaged, some limped badly, others looked barely old enough to shave. This wasn't the Wehrmacht that had conquered Poland and France. This was the broken remnant of a failed empire. The escort brought them to a cluster of command vehicles parked beneath camouflage netting. Officers in field gray uniforms stood around folding tables covered with maps, their conversation stopping abruptly as the American jeep approached. One man stood slightly apart from the others, his bearing marking him as the senior commander even before Whitlock noticed the insignia of a major general on his collar. According to post-war records accessed by historians from the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, the German officer was Major General Johann Foltmann, commander of what remained of the 19th Army's rear guard units, a career officer who had fought on 3 fronts and watched his command slowly disintegrate through years of retreat. Foltmann was perhaps 50 years old, his face carved with deep lines of exhaustion and something that looked like relief. He studied Whitlock with intelligent eyes as the American lieutenant climbed from the jeep, came to attention, and delivered the most outrageous statement of his military career. "General Foltmann, I am Lieutenant Albert Whitlock of the United States 36th Infantry Division. I am authorized to accept your immediate and unconditional surrender." The silence following Whitlock's declaration was absolute. German officers stared at the young American lieutenant, as if he'd announced he was Napoleon returned from the grave. Foltmann's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise on his otherwise impassive face. Then, unexpectedly, Foltmann smiled, a thin, bitter expression devoid of humor. "Lieutenant," he replied in excellent English, "I count 4 of you and approximately 15,000 of my troops. Please explain the mathematics of this surrender." This was the moment. Whitlock had rehearsed his next words during the drive, knowing that everything depended on delivering them with absolute conviction. He met Foltmann's gaze without flinching. "General, you're an experienced officer. You know this war is over. Germany has surrendered. Your Führer is dead. Your government has collapsed. Every day you continue, more of your men die for absolutely nothing." Whitlock gestured toward the surrounding mountains. "I have 3 battalions moving into positions around this valley right now, with artillery zeroed on this entire column. You can test whether I'm bluffing. It will cost you thousands of casualties. Or you can accept reality and save their lives." It was a masterful combination of truth and fabrication. The war truly was over. Hitler genuinely was dead. Germany had indeed collapsed. The only lie was the 3 battalions that didn't exist. Foltmann studied Whitlock with unsettling intensity, as if reading his soul for deception. The other German officers watched their commander, waiting for his response. Whitlock kept his expression neutral, radiating quiet certainty, while his heart threatened to hammer through his chest. "You are either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily foolish, Lieutenant Whitlock," Foltmann finally said. "Perhaps both." "I'm a realist, General, and so are you." Foltmann turned away, walking a few steps toward the map table. He stood there, shoulders slightly bent, one hand resting on the table's surface. His officers remained frozen, uncertain whether to maintain their defensive posture or stand down. Everything hung in perfect, terrible balance. When Foltmann spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried clearly in the mountain air. "I have served Germany for 27 years. I have watched good men die for bad reasons and worse leadership. I have retreated from Russia, from Italy, from France. I am tired of watching boys die for a cause that died long before they did." He turned back to face Whitlock, and the young American lieutenant saw something unexpected in the German general's eyes. Not defeat, but relief. The relief of a man who had been searching for an honorable exit from a dishonorable situation. "You have no 3 battalions in these mountains, Lieutenant. If you did, we would have detected their movements. What you have is audacity and timing." Foltmann's smile returned, warmer this time. "And perhaps that is enough." Foltmann called his senior officers together, and spoke to them in rapid German that Whitlock couldn't follow. He caught occasional words: Amerikanisch, capitulation, Ende. But the meanings were clear enough from the officers' reactions. Some looked relieved, others appeared stricken. A few seemed openly angry. A colonel with an iron cross pinned to his tunic argued vehemently, gesturing toward the surrounding troops, but Foltman cut him off with a sharp command. The general turned back to Whitlock. "My officers wish to know the terms of surrender. Will my men be treated according to the Geneva Convention? Will they be handed over to the Soviets?" Whitlock had anticipated these questions. "All prisoners will be treated according to international law. You'll surrender to American forces and remain in American custody. I give you my word as an officer." It was a promise that carried weight. Throughout the war, German soldiers had desperately sought to surrender to Western allies rather than Soviet forces, knowing that Soviet captivity meant probable death or years in labor camps. American custody, while still imprisonment, at least offered survival. Foltman nodded slowly. "Then we accept your terms, Lieutenant Whitlock. I will order my command to lay down their arms." He extended his hand, and Whitlock shook it, a surreal moment of military courtesy amid the chaos of war's end. The German general began issuing orders, and his staff officers scattered to relay commands throughout the massive column. Whitlock watched the process unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He'd done it. They'd actually done it. 4 men with a single jeep had just accepted the surrender of 15,000 German troops. Johnson leaned close and muttered, "Lieutenant, when headquarters hears about this, they're either going to give you a medal or court-martial you for disobeying orders." "Probably both," Whitlock replied with a tight grin. The surrender process took hours to organize. German soldiers began stacking their rifles in enormous piles, their expressions ranging from relieved to traumatized to hollow-eyed exhaustion. Foltman maintained perfect military discipline, ensuring the disarmament proceeded in an orderly fashion. Whitlock radioed headquarters, requesting immediate assistance to secure and process the prisoners. The response was chaos on the other end: disbelief, urgent questions, demands for confirmation. When Whitlock calmly repeated that he had accepted the surrender of 15,000 German troops, there was a long silence followed by, "Say again, Lieutenant? Did you say 15,000? "Affirmative. 15000. I need transport, supply, and processing units immediately." Major General Dahlquist himself came on the radio, his voice incredulous. "Whitlock, how in God's name did you accomplish this?" "Creative tactical thinking, sir. Just like they taught us at the academy." By late afternoon on May 5, 1945, American forces began arriving in strength to take custody of the surrendered German troops. Transport trucks, military police units, and supply convoys wound their way up the mountain roads, transforming the remote Austrian valley into a massive prisoner-of-war processing center. Officers from divisional headquarters arrived to document what was already being called Whitlock's Bluff, a piece of military audacity that would enter the history books as one of the war's most remarkable bloodless victories. Colonel William Harrison, the division's chief of staff, found Whitlock supervising the prisoner processing with his 3 companions. Harrison was a by-the-book officer who'd spent 30 years in the Army, and his expression suggested he couldn't decide whether to embrace Whitlock or arrest him. "Lieutenant," Harrison began carefully, "you do realize you violated approximately a dozen regulations, ignored your reconnaissance parameters, exceeded your authority, and risked an international incident." "Yes, sir," Whitlock replied simply. "And you did it anyway." "Yes, sir." Harrison studied the young lieutenant for a long moment, then looked out at the thousands of surrendered German soldiers being peacefully processed, lives saved on both sides. "Well," he said finally, "at least you got results." The official after-action report, which can be reviewed in the military archives as documented in various historical analyses of the war's final days, credited Whitlock's initiative, courage, and unconventional tactical approach with securing the surrender of between 15,000 and 18,000 German troops without a single casualty on either side. The exact number remained somewhat uncertain due to the chaotic conditions, but all sources agreed it represented one of the largest single surrenders to such a small American unit during the entire war. Foltman, in the weeks following his capture, was extensively debriefed by Allied intelligence. According to those interviews, he confirmed that Whitlock's bluff had succeeded not because he believed the Phantom battalions existed, but because the young American had offered him exactly what he'd been seeking, an honorable end to a dishonorable situation. The German general had been looking for someone confident enough to accept responsibility for 15,000 lives, and Whitlock had provided that confidence. "I knew the war was over," Foltman told his interrogators. "My men knew it. We were simply waiting for someone to make the ending official. Lieutenant Whitlock gave us that opportunity." The three men who had accompanied Whitlock on that insane mission, Johnson, Martinez, and Henderson, were each awarded the Silver Star for valor. Whitlock himself received the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration, with a citation praising his extraordinary heroism and exceptional leadership in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. The story of Whitlock's bluff spread rapidly through Allied ranks in the final days of the European War, becoming the kind of legend that soldiers told and retold, each version perhaps slightly embellished but fundamentally true in its core impossibility. Here was proof that courage, quick thinking, and sheer audacity could sometimes accomplish what entire armies could not. When Lieutenant Albert Whitlock returned home to Pennsylvania in November 1945, he was greeted as a hero, though he consistently downplayed his actions. In interviews with local newspapers, he insisted he'd simply been doing his job and gave equal credit to Johnson, Martinez, and Henderson. "Those three men trusted me enough to follow me into madness," he said. "That takes more courage than anything I did." Whitlock remained in the Army after the war, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1968. He taught military history at West Point for several years, using his own experience as a case study in unconventional warfare and the importance of understanding enemy psychology. His lectures emphasized that the greatest victories sometimes came not from superior firepower, but from superior understanding of human nature. The broader implications of Whitlock's achievement extended beyond one remarkable afternoon in the Austrian Alps. Military historians and strategists have studied the incident extensively, recognizing it as a perfect example of psychological warfare, negotiation under pressure, and the importance of seizing opportunity in fluid combat situations. The story appears in numerous military academies' curricula worldwide, analyzed for lessons about leadership, risk assessment, and creative problem-solving. General Johann Foltman survived the war and returned to his family in Bavaria, where he lived quietly until his death in 1971. In his later years, he occasionally corresponded with Whitlock, and the two men developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect. In one letter, preserved in Whitlock's personal papers, Foltman wrote, "You gave me and my men the gift of survival when we desperately needed it. For that, I remain eternally grateful." The three enlisted men who shared Whitlock's Jeep that day returned to civilian life after the war. Harold Johnson became a teacher in Oregon. Eugene Martinez opened a successful restaurant in New Mexico, and Robert Henderson worked as a carpenter in Michigan. They remained friends throughout their lives, reuniting annually on May 5th to commemorate the day they helped end a war with nothing but nerve and a calculated bluff. When Whitlock died in March 1996 at the age of 75, his obituary in the New York Times dedicated several paragraphs to the story of how a young lieutenant with 3 men and a Jeep convinced 15,000 German troops to surrender. The article noted that his actions had likely saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives on both sides. Allied soldiers who would have died capturing the German force, and German soldiers who would have died defending it. The enduring lesson of Whitlock's bluff transcends military strategy. It speaks to the power of confidence, the importance of understanding your opponent, and the reality that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the one in your hand, but the one in your mind. In an age where warfare increasingly emphasized technological superiority and overwhelming force, Whitlock demonstrated that human psychology remained the ultimate battlefield. Today, the stretch of Austrian mountain road where Whitlock accepted Foltman's surrender is marked by a small monument, placed there in 2005 on the 60th anniversary of the event. The inscription, in both English and German, reads simply, "Here, on May 5, 1945, courage and reason ended a battle before it could begin. 4 men saved thousands." It stands as testament to an extraordinary moment when audacity, timing, and a deep understanding of human nature combine to achieve the impossible, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from knowing precisely when and how to stop.